12 months of Messier, month one on episode 518 of the actual astronomy podcast. I'm Chris. Joining me is Shane. We are amateur astronomers that love looking up at the night sky. And this podcast is for everybody who enjoys going out under the stars. So we'll read a couple emails first, Shane. We have one from Kevin, and I'll read it because sometimes what's happening to me recently is I'm getting busy and I'm reading emails as I'm walking, which is a terrible idea. And then I think I've replied and I have not. I don't know if that's ever happened to you before.
Oh yeah, yeah. I have email overload between work and personal, and then you add the podcast in, and it's just too much email, and yeah, hard to keep track of it all sometimes.
Yeah. And right now, I'm really, as I was telling you before the show, quite bogged down in the calendar work. And yeah, and so I have, many emails coming in from the calendar every day and trying to sort that stuff out and personal emails and work emails go without saying. Although right now I'm not getting I don't hardly get any work emails. So it's a good place for work emails, but they're all in at my workplace anyway. So,
Hmm.
but but that's a whole different kettle of fish. We won't get into that. All right. So I had this email from Kevin, which my apologies, Kevin, I didn't get around to replying to. And you're writing to give us an update on your observatory. Kevin writes, Hi, Chris and Shane. I just listened to your observer's calendar update for January, and I realized I haven't touched base with you folks in some time. Here in Missouri, we've been blessed lately with dry weather and warm temperatures. It was 75 degrees on Christmas Day, which I think is like into the teens. Am I wrong? That's pretty warm.
Yeah, that's quite nice, I think.
The good weather plus holiday vacation time enabled me to get a lot of work done on my black hole, the observatory. Please see attached for some photos of the progress that has been made since October. The roof slides smoothly with one hand. Awesome. And I have just finished extending the rail system out to the final length. The important thing is that now it is enclosed, and when the bad weather hits, I can work on the inside. I just finished roughing in the electrical outlets. Next is wood paneling and carpet. Once the carpet is in, I will mount the telescopes. The interior needs a lot of work, but I cannot wait any longer. Shane, looking forward to your experience with the Pi Finder since you finally acquired it. I hope you get some warm, clear evenings soon. Clear skies. Kevin. Thanks for that, Kevin.
Yeah, yeah, and we have some more coming our way as well, and I'm hoping to get outside with the Pi Finder and give it a run to see how it works for me.
Yeah, I was looking at Kevin's photos as I was walking, and like I did even look at them later, but looks like he's got like some gel over his windows, and he has almost looks like the primary colors like green, red, blue, orange, or yellow. I was curious about that setup. Anyway, I'm curious to see when he gets it finished, but it looks pretty cool. Looks like a great observatory. Can't wait to see how it pans out.
Yeah, me too.
Good stuff. Do you want to read Peter, who is Patreon supported? Do you want to read Peter's correspondence there?
Yeah, he said the podcast and our correspondence means a great deal to me. I am so much further along with the hobby than I would have been otherwise. It's been cloudy and chilly, at least by Phoenix standards, over the last couple of weeks. I got out for the first time in a while for a quick grab and go session with my Teleview 85 and my M2C mount on Thursday night. I used a Messier 32 millimeter together with the Beta 8 by 24 millimeter and SV Bony 3 by 8 millimeter zooms. I would say now that the Messier 32 is my most used eyepiece, especially since I spend so much time on wide field views. It's just so convenient to use, and it gives the same field as the XW40. The SV Bony is such a bargain and has that 8 millimeter focal length, which helps in centering targets. It's also easy to find the best high magnification for the given seeing. I looked at Jupiter mostly at 150 times and 130 times and saw 3 cloud bands in the red spot quite clearly. Very nice. Also, I looked at Struve 627, as mentioned in the podcast. I used the Beta Zoom for this. It's fun watching the components of a pair separate as you increase the power with the zoom. I didn't see much color difference though. I also looked at M42. Not much nebulosity from the backyard compared with CSV, but the trapezium is always a delight. Looked at Rigel, but only the slightest hint of the companion, if at all. Last night I was out with the 12 by 36 Canon IS binoculars, yet another podcast inspired purchase. Had a nice view of Jupiter and three of the Galilean moons. Next week I will spend the new moon weekend at CSV, hoping for clear skies. From Peter. Yeah, thanks
Oh,
for that, Peter. I'm a little jealous of your CSV trip.
I
Hopefully,
know.
hopefully you have great conditions and get some really nice observing done.
No, I'm looking at getting down to the States this year for maybe whether it ends up being like an astronomy trip or a somewhat astronomy related adventure. We shall see. But I would like to get down. But anyway, just trying to finagle a lot of things. So, Shane, this business with the Messier objects and going through them on a month-to-month basis is something I've been kicking around in the back of my mind for a while because um, every once in a while I run across the SED site. I'm not sure if you're familiar with SEDS, but it's seds.org. If you want to check that out, I think it stands for like the Students Educational or Education in Space or something like that. But anyway, they've got a really good area on deep sky objects and different objects by all the historical figures like Messier and the Herschels and all this kind of stuff. But they've got a section in there that breaks up the Messier objects by month. Okay.
Hmm, okay.
And I like that idea. I kind of, in a way, disagree with maybe some of their picks per month, but I was like, well, you know what? We'll just kind of start peeling through them maybe and talking about them like that because I think it makes for some interesting content. And I keep running across it thinking, oh, we should do like a podcast on this, or maybe we should do one each month. And then every once in a while, we have like a gap in what we're thinking about putting out on a particular week or something. And this was one of those weeks. And I thought, well, why don't we just start this now? It's like a new year and kind of making some new types of podcasts. And let's just give this one a rock and roll and see how it goes. Plus, like we'll just do it for a year. And then if we don't like doing these type of things every month, we can just change gears.
Yeah, no, I like it. The Messier list can be a little daunting if you think of 110 objects, but it's quite, it's quite easy to get done within 1 year. And dividing and conquering, by 12 months really helps kind of spread it out. And then that way you don't have to be super dependent on, a small number of nights maybe, to get it done. This way, if the conditions aren't great, you just wait till the next opportunity and keep going.
And maybe what we can do is if people do follow along with us, or maybe not, if they can send in their Messier observations, and I'll try to group all that
Hmm,
material together, and then together between you and I, Shane, and the listeners, we'll produce a set of these 12 Messier podcasts. How does that sound?
I like it.
Okay. So, for starters, I don't like the Messier list.
Why is that?
Well, I feel like it's maybe it's just miscategorized or something. It's put out as a list of the best deep sky objects, and in my experience in looking at all the Messiers, I don't feel that's true. I feel
Mhm.
like there are some of the best deep sky objects in there without a doubt, but then also not so much. Like there's some really really big misses, and I feel like it's unfortunate because I feel like it really sort of puts too much of a narrow focus on the Messier objects, and then there's a lot of people who get into astronomy and then they never sort of go off pieced into some of the better finest NGC objects as I see them. Not to get into the whole racket with the finest NGC. Well, maybe we'll have Alan Dyer on at some point and talk about those too. But that there's lots of great objects. Like I think of the Alpha Persei moving group, which is awesome. I think about Kemble's Cascade, which
Mhm.
everybody should look at. Just a series of stars, And then if we're talking series of stars, like the coat hanger cluster, like everybody who's new to astronomy has to go and look at the coat hanger cluster. And if you're looking at that kind of stuff, there's all kinds of other objects. Then if we think about some of the nebulae, like the Veil Nebula, I mean, not a Messier object, but come on, folks, like you got to go and look at the Veil Nebula if you're getting into this. But I would look at the Veil Nebula way more than I would look at, like I don't know, Messier 61, for example, right? Okay.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So there's a lot of things to that. I've often thought that, and I know that Orion used to have the Deep Map 600, which is a little bit too deep. But I've often thought there almost needs to be a little bit of a redo on what the best 100 objects are. And maybe that'll be next year. Who knows, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic because it's quite subjective, but like in terms of what are the best 100. But I do agree with you. In terms of the Messier list, there's a few on there that certainly are outclassed by other objects,
Yeah.
and a few that were that if you're coming up with a best of list, you probably wouldn't put on there.
Yeah.
But in terms of being maybe the most popular list, I can certainly wrap my head around that. And there are a lot of great things to see on the list. And I know we'll get into the history of how this list came to be. And I think that helps explain why, the Veil was maybe not on that list and why
Yep.
some others are on that list.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So I'm going to hit us up with some resources first. Maybe they shouldn't go here, but I'm going to put them in first. So people should go and check out the SED site at messier.seds.org/Messier, or if you type in Messier .seds, and it's Messier.seds. So they've got lots of great resources on there. Another great resource, I would say, if you're going to get a book on it, probably the best one is the Atlas of the Messier Objects, Highlights of the Deep Sky by Ronald Stoyan. Another great one is the Deep Sky Companions series, which has the Messier objects as well by Stephen O'Meara, which I hear is a new one that's coming out.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
it's I think it's out of publication. You can find lots of used copies. I've gone through a couple copies myself. Another really awesome book that is available only used, and I would say if you were going to buy one book and you didn't want to spend the money on the other two because they can be a little bit expensive, the best, least expensive book with the best information is Messier Nebula and Star Clusters by Kenneth Glyn Jones. That's really quite awesome. And then the very best book on early nebula and cluster explorers is long out of print, and it's a very tiny book. It's like a pamphlet almost with hardcover copy. It's maybe 60 or 80 pages long, and it's called The Search for the Nebulae by Ken Glyn Jones as well. And then you've got one there, I see.
Yeah, it's one that I really like, and our observing friend Mike got me onto it. It's called The Year-Round Messier Marathon Field Guide. The author's Harvard Pennington.
Hmm.
And what I like about this is, it's a hardcover. I'm not sure if it comes in any other format, so I just like the feel of it, and it's really nice paper. But it does map it out, in a structure of how you can observe it throughout the year. So kind of has the right order, especially for the topic that we're on here for a 12-month guide. But what is really neat about this, like when you open it up and you go to any of the objects, on the right-hand side, it has the constellation and, all of the key stars and where the Messier object is. So you have that as a guide. It tells you everything you need to know around the data of that particular object, the brightness, the angular size, all of that kind of stuff. Has a little bit of a write-up, so it tells you about the history when Messier discovered it. Sometimes he references Burnham and others, and a little bit of a guide, that if you can see it in small telescopes, binoculars, what aperture you need. But what is also really neat is for every object, there are 8 by 50 finder charts, both right angle and straight through. There's always a sketch, so you get an idea of what this thing will look like through the eyepiece. And then each object also has like Telrad finders. So it's really helpful to help you navigate and find these things and kind of give you everything you need for success.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And then we should mention Don McCult's guide to the Messier Marathon
Mm-hmm.
as well, though I don't know how well that's published these days, sadly, as Don passed away in 2022. Equipment, of course, you're going to need your eyes. Binoculars, I think I've seen them all in binoculars now. And in fact, one autumn, 2023, I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to see Messier 76 in my binoculars, and I feel fairly confident that I did see it after 2 or 3 nights of trying. Small telescopes, of course, and then big telescopes. And maybe we'll start with what your introduction was to the Messier object, Shane, before we get into the history of it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think a few listeners will probably remember this story, but when I got my first real telescope, which was an 8-inch Skywatcher, my plan for observing was to just really only look at solar system stuff, the moon and the planets, and I would be very content with that. And at the start, I kind of was. Jupiter was in the sky. Obviously, the moon was going through its phases, so I had a lot to look at. But two things quickly became apparent to me. Number one, when I'm looking at Jupiter, it's not like the photographs. And you can only at least myself, I can only look at Jupiter for so many minutes or hours in a night before I'm getting a little bit bored. And then the other thing was when I started out, I just assumed the planets were visible every night. And I
Mm,
didn't realize there was periods throughout the year where no planets were visible, or I'd have to wake up at 3 in the morning to see a planet.
nothing like that.
So I needed something else to observe. So I
Mm,
thought, maybe I'll check out this deep sky stuff. And everything I read at that point in beginning was, or at the beginning, was to start with the Messier list. That it's a very common list for beginners. And so I started chopping away at that from my backyard here in Regina. Um, and then I don't know, I probably did about 25 to 30 or 40 of them from the backyard. And then I had my first experience at a deep sky site. And I had seen M31 from my backyard many times. But then when I saw it from a dark sky site, I couldn't believe the difference it made. And it really sort of reset my account on the Messier list. I didn't care about the observations I had from the backyard. I was now interested in seeing them all from dark skies. So
mm.
that's how it started for me. How about you?
Yeah, my experience was a little different because somebody had given me a pair of binoculars to get started and bought me the Backyard Astronomer's Guide. And then I quickly bought a copy of Night Watch for myself. And because I only had 10 by 50 binoculars and didn't really have the funds at the time to buy a telescope myself, I ended up being a little bit disappointed with the Messiers, right? So maybe this is where it comes from for me because once you run through those, maybe 15 or 20 of the really bright things, it is pretty tough to see the others in binoculars. And in my yard wasn't too bad. Like my yard was not quite as good as my observing site out at the cabin, but it was like a little bit more than halfway between like being in the city here and being out there. Um, like magnitude 5.6, 5.7 in my backyard, not too bad. So you could see quite a bit. And in going through what else seemed to be available, and I guess maybe was formative, is that I kind of had to comb through the 2 or 3 books I was able to get my hands on and a few books from the library and try to figure out, okay, well, what else is visible? Because, I could only see these maybe, like I said, 20 or so objects. And then I found out that, oh, you can see like the Helix Nebula with binoculars. That's actually a lot easier to see than with the telescope sometimes, just because you have the big wide field of view. And if you have good contrast and good southern horizon like I did, then yeah, knew my neighbor to the south, ended up working for him eventually, and he was kind enough to turn his lights off for me and things of that nature. So, you can see quite a bit in binoculars. That's when I found out about like the Alpha Perseus group and things like the Hyades and some of the other large clusters in and around Orion and all that kind of stuff. And so that was sort of where I started in all this astronomy. So then eventually a few years later when I was able to get myself an 8-inch telescope that really didn't work very well, I you go from looking at something like the Alpha Persei moving group to like, Messier 67, and you're kind of like, it's really not really mind blowing at that point, right?
Hmm.
So that was sort of my introduction to it. But when I did get a telescope, I decided I would go and take a look at them all, and yeah, then kind of did work through them all in about a year, and some of them I was more taken with than others. But then it was always in my mind, well, there are a lot more and varied objects in the night sky to look at than just the messy objects, and perhaps that's just my message here for the folks who are listening is that it is worthwhile doing. I'm not going to argue against that, but that to keep in mind that there certainly are lots of other things to look at in the night sky.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, who was Charles Messier? Well, he lived from 1730 to 1817 and published an initial catalog of about 100 nebula stars and star clusters to help early telescope users differentiate permanent items from transient comets in the night sky. So, the whole point of the list also was not to catalog the best and the brightest or whatever. It was meant to help differentiate the stuff that was always there from the comets that were just whipping through the night sky to help people who were hunting these comets. And that's the whole rationale and reasoning behind what Messier was trying to do. And it was later expanded to 110 objects, which have become known as the Messier objects. And these are all denoted with a preceding M followed by a number. And he was the 10th of 12 children, though most of his brothers and sisters died during childhood, as was the custom in those days. And his interest in astronomy was ignited at the age of 14 when he witnessed the great six-tailed comet of 1744 and then an annular solar eclipse, which was visible from his home in 1748. Eventually, he was employed by Joe Delisle at the Royal Navy Observatory, or the French Navy Observatory. And he started there in 1751. And this was, strangely enough, at the Hotel de Cluny. And that's where they made their observations. And a couple notes that Messier did not discover all 110 objects. Many were made by, in particular, his friend and assistant, Pierre Méchain, and as well as others that we'll get into as we work through this. Um, but it is kind of strange that they did this at the Hotel de Cluny. And when I was in France in 2009, just before I moved out here, that's where I went. I spent several days at the Hotel de Cluny checking it out. And they don't have a whole lot there on Messier. I don't recommend going there unless you're really into this stuff. But you can see where he had some of his astronomical instruments mounted. You can see the top of the tower where they observed from. All that stuff is still there, but there's very, very little in there. And when I did ask about it, and at the time had much better French than I do today, they really weren't interested in talking about Charles Messier. They basically told me that he trashed the place, but it was an old Roman bath, and perhaps he had made some modifications for astronomical purposes that didn't serve some of that historical preservation as well as perhaps it should have. Messier used a whole pile of different instruments. Shane, I'm not going to run through all these, but he used a variety of reflectors and refractors. And it almost seems like instead of having different eyepieces, he had different telescopes, eh?
Yeah, yeah. It's quite interesting actually. And the focal length of these things is like almost unimaginable by today's standards.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So typically, I think they ranged in aperture from about 3 or 4 inches for the refractors. I think his biggest refractor was about 4 inches, and some of them were like 10 feet long. Some of them were like 25 feet long. Um, and then there was some Newtonian reflectors, I think, that were equivalent to about a 6-ish inch reflector these days. And then he was using powers from about 40 magnification ish up to about looks like about 140 or so powers. So nothing too extreme there. Um, his first list of objects was 45, and you have to imagine, and the 45th object, of course, was what?
I don't know offhand.
M45?
Oh, the Pleiades. Sorry, I thought you said M40.
No. So, and well, that's a good point because the way we think about things now is more like in groups of 10, okay, or in groups of 100 or so. And we those are the numbers that kind of catch our attention now, like a top 10 list or maybe a top 5 or but typically we group things in groups of 10 and groups of 100. But they didn't really do that so much back then. And so he was enamored with like 45. So even though the Pleiades was so well known at the time, he dropped it in kind of sort of anyway, just to round it to a nice even 45, right? As we might think
Okay.
of rounding something to the nearest 10 or the nearest 100. That's why he did that. And that's how the Pleiades ended up in the darn list. So sometimes people wonder why that one's in there. That's kind of sort of why that one is in there, sort of to simplify it. And that first list of 45 was published in 1774, with the final list of 103 objects appearing in 1784, and that was published in the uh, Connaissance des Temps. So you can look that one up if you want. Um, the list is meant to aid, or was meant to aid Messier and the other astronomers of the day who were focused on hunting comets and gaining fame, fortune, or whatever, and that they were really viewing these deep sky objects as nuisance objects. Sometimes they would masquerade as comets, especially in twilight or moonlit conditions. And they were really just looking for ways to quickly identify whether or not a smudge, a faint smudge, was a comet coming around the sun, or whether it was just one of these nuisance deep sky objects, which I don't think they quite called deep sky objects back in those days. They just called them nebulae or mists or whatever. Oddly, Messier only discovered about 13 comets and was co-discoverer on others, but we don't really know him for his comets. We know him for these deep sky inconvenience objects, eh?
Yeah, exactly.
And then a few decades, uh, well ago, I was going to say a couple hundred years after Messier almost, Don McCulloch came along, came up with the idea of the Messier Marathon. I think that really helped popularize it amongst amateur astronomers. The idea that, um, well, I mean, it is tough to go out and observe 110 of these objects, but then people started doing it, starting with pretty much Don McCulloch's, in an evening or in an entire night, 24-hour period. Uh, in the spring of each year, you can go out and see most of these objects. Seeing 110 is pretty darn near impossible. The McCullochs had done it. But even myself and my buddy Graham, when we were starting out in astronomy, we went out and were able to kind of work together, and we saw, I think, 80 or close to 80 or 90 objects in the course of like a midnight to morning and then following evening kind of thing in a 24-hour period. So it is kind of cool that you can go out and see all these just the way they happen to be laid out in the nighttime sky.
Yeah, and a lot of clubs embraced it and make a big event out of the Messier Marathon where, a lot of members will come out to the same location and try to observe as many as they can throughout the night.
So getting started, Messier 33, discovered by Messier in 1764, M33. Very large object, larger than the face of the full moon, and it's a face-on spiral galaxy in the constellation of Triangulum. M33 is about magnitude 5.3, so that sounds pretty bright, Shane. Does it
Yeah. Yep.
look like a 5.3 magnitude object to you?
No. It's the brightness is quite dispersed. And in fact, that that particular object was the first time I learned about, apparent magnitude and how it can be somewhat misleading. And 5.3 is a collection of all of the light, but because this object is so large, it's somewhat challenging to see. Like you need a dark sky for that one.
Yep. And so you can look for it with binoculars is really the best way to first pick it up. I've talked to a lot of people who first try with the telescope and struggle, but because it is a low surface brightness object, seeing it for the first time with binoculars is, I think, the easiest way to pick it up. And I have been able to see it from the really dark skies of like grasslands and other equally dark locations, but it is a heck of a tough naked eye object. To find it, it's up in Triangulum. It's best to find it by sweeping and use your lowest power. And what you do is you just look for a change in background light levels. If you have a telescope, you can try to identify the bright knot. There's an emission region called NGC 604, and it's in the northeastern arm. And you can actually see that in the Lord Ross sketch I included here at the right. You can see he's got a couple of the knots in there, and you can see that sort of spiral arm type uh, pattern in the Lord Ross sketch, and certainly in a 6 inch or larger telescope, you really do get the sense of that spiral structure, at least to my eye.
Yeah, yeah. The right night with the right telescope, it jumps out at you.
M103. This is a fairly small, sparse open cluster in Cassiopeia, first seen by Messier in 1781. So it was the last object in that initial list as published in 1784. And what you do is just look for a tight group of stars. Be careful not to mistake the one of the other open clusters in the area because there is a whole pile in that area. So you kind of have to use a chart to figure out which one of those is the open cluster. Through a telescope, the cluster is very sparse with only four bright stars shown in amongst the midst of fainter stars. But that definitely isn't one of the brighter Messier objects for sure. Or at least it has just a few bright stars and then a pile of sort of fainter stars in the background there. M52, perhaps this is one of the more popular open clusters discovered by Messier in 1774, a rich open cluster, also up in Cassiopeia. And really, it's a great object to see in binoculars and then with small telescopes as a faint smudge. Mid-sized telescopes begin to resolve the cluster, and you can look for a triangular patch of light with some stars clearly resolved, and certainly the larger and larger the telescope you use, you'll start to resolve this graininess of the open cluster into stars. And my note is that M52 sits along this beautiful chain of nebula and star clusters that runs up from Cassiopeia into Perseus. And this is like a very rich Milky Way region, which is really, really great for exploring. But I didn't want to get into too many of those other objects up in that area, but certainly if you have the time, it's worth exploring. Like the Cave Nebula, and then there's a bunch of King open clusters up there. I've certainly spent lots of evenings up in the area around M52 exploring. M76, that was first seen by Messier in 1780, known as the Little Dumbbell. This was my nemesis Messier object, Shane. I found this one really tough to see.
Yeah, from my early days, this one was the most challenging because I think part of it was because I was also a new observer or new to observing. I maybe wasn't like fully understanding what I would be seeing here, and you sort of get used to the size and brightness of some of the other objects, and then this one isn't like that.
No, it's a planetary nebula up in Perseus, and one of the faintest objects in the Messier catalog. Look for a small, faint oblong patch of light. I think it's around eighth or so magnitude, and it's not a very obvious object. Like it just looks like an out of focus star at low power. So you want to like use some higher power, and fortunately, it's located near a brighter star, which helps to aid in finding it. But yeah, you definitely need a good finder chart to see that one. Unlike M34, Messier 34, which is a huge, large, bright, um, but sparse cluster in Perseus, first seen by Sicilian observer Hodierne in the early 1600s, visible as a faint patch of light to the unaided eye, even and sort of in the Medusa's head region of the allegorical night sky patterns. Binoculars definitely provide the best view of this. I've done a lot of sketches of M34. I can probably just about sketch this one with my eyes closed. Probably my most sketched object as far as an open cluster goes in binoculars. I think I've sketched it every year for like a decade. I don't know why. I think it just looks so good in binoculars. And oddly, it does not look very good in a telescope at all, Shane.
Yeah, yeah. Low magnification is the key for sure.
Yeah. M74 up in Perseus, apparently, and it's in around the 10th magnitude, is the faintest of the Messier objects. I don't find this one particularly that difficult to observe. Discovered by Messier, not Messier, in 1780. And you need a dark sky-ish. I mean, I can see it even with some light pollution, and what you want to do is basically look up in Pisces, and then you can find it as a fuzzy star with a central concentration and surrounded by a faint glow. You can try different magnifications on this. It does hold magnification quite well, and it does benefit from darker and darker skies, that's for sure. But I've seen this one in my 17 by 36s, and I was observing this M77, which is next, and M76 all in the same evening, and still, even to this day, for sure, M76 I think is the most challenging out of these three.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Moving on to M77, this is a small faint galaxy in Cetus and is another one of Messier's discoveries from 1780. Easy in binoculars. Well, not easy. I mean, if it's high up, it's easy. If it's low down, like you definitely will see it more as a fuzzy star. Through a telescope, it's really quite nice through a 4-inch or larger telescope as an oval patch. And it has a nice bright center fading towards the edges. So, yeah. I mean, these ones are sort of an interesting mishmash of some galaxies, clusters, and and well, the galaxy M33, which is almost like a whole thing in itself. But it's sort of an interesting smattering. I think I should have put more of the magnitudes in. I'll try to do that next time, and we'll just sort of kind of keep this evolving as we go forward. And if there's other things people want to include, or if you want to send in sketches or your observations of the Messier objects as we're working on this, please go ahead and do so.
Yeah, and these show notes will be posted on actualastronomy.com. So probably should have mentioned it at the start in case anybody was feverishly trying to write all of this down. You can go there for the reference and everything we just talked about.
Awesome. Thanks for listening, everybody. And special thanks to our Patreon supporters for making the show possible. Send us your ideas, observations, and questions to actualastronomy@gmail.com.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. If you are interested in more information, would like to contact us, or if you would like to support the podcast, check out our website, actualastronomy.com.